Siem Reap Province. My name is George Chigas. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar brought to you by the Center for Khmer Studies in Siem Reap, Cambodia. Tonight we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ashley Tu Thao Keng Dam, who will be presenting her research entitled Beyond Binaries, How Collaborative Approaches in Healing through Biomedicine, Traditional and Folk Medicine Practices may expand care-seeking and care opportunities for COVID-19. A word about Dr. Dam, Dr. Ashley Tu Thao Keng Dam, who uses the personal pronouns they and them, is a medical anthropologist and ethnobotanist. Previously based in Turin, Italy, is now at Maastricht University in the Netherlands in the Department of Health, Ethics, and Society. Their research straddles the realms of maternal and child nutrition, Asian studies, biodiversity conservation, and traditional and complementary medicines. Very interdisciplinary, as you can see. Through their research, Ashley endeavors to build bridges between medical anthropology, food and nutritional anthropology, ethnobotany, and food studies. They examine the intersections of how changes in human ecological conditions can potentially reorganize priorities and practices relating to food medicines for rural populations in particular. What makes Siem Reap Province an especially intriguing place to study these topics is its multiple levels and forms of ecological instability, which include, but are not limited to, seasonal flooding, work migration, tourism patterns, and, not insignificantly, as we found in 2020 when Ashley arrived at CKS to do her research, the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me quickly read the abstract for this presentation so we can begin to put this research into some kind of larger context. And I'll follow that up with just a very brief comment of my own. Drawing from qualitative insights gathered through anthropological in-person data collection during February 2020 to late March 2020, this talk explores the different relationalities and rationalities expressed by groups living in Siem Reap Province regarding preventing or treating COVID-19 symptoms with either biomedicine, traditional and/or folk medicine. It considers the localized designations, hierarchies, and priorities of which individual or combinations of medical systems are best suited to handle illnesses overall, as well as during health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. It provides a glimpse into how the medical pluralism of the Cambodian healthcare landscape manifests in individual care-seeking and health decisions, and considers how these tensions can be mobilized to expand care as opposed to gathering or generating further divisions. So one thing that I'm immediately drawn to when coming across a study like this is the way that it compels the reader to question epistemological categories and terms that we often take for granted. Specifically in this case, words and terms like medicine, health, nutrition, food, disease, the treatment of disease, doctor, patient, etc. We should be wary of assigning fixed meanings to these concepts and terms. Each term has an historical trajectory that undergoes constant change and modification, which in this case are particular to Cambodian culture and society. As someone interested in Cambodian cultural history, I try to trace and understand these changes historically. Of particular interest are the historical moments when Cambodian culture has come into contact with outside cultures for various reasons. These would include Indian, Thai, French cultural influences, among others, and currently the profound Chinese and Western influences taking place in Cambodia. Regarding today's presentation, it should go without saying that the history of medicine in Cambodia did not begin with the early 20th century French colonial programs to inoculate the Khmer population against diseases like smallpox. Indigenous Khmer concepts of the body and illnesses, such as the essential notion of the body spirit, or pralung, and illnesses, which are sometimes referred to as kok chal, and treatments and practices to secure the spirit to the body or consult a kru khmer to rid the body of a malevolent spirit and correct the direction of the body's winds, had previously, presumably, existed and evolved for many centuries before Khmer contact with any foreign cultural influences. Ashley's presentation focuses on a recent moment in the cultural history of Khmer medicine. It provides us with a fascinating case study of how the use of traditional medicines, TKM, as she refers to them, in Khmer food medicines, or KFM, as Ashley refers to them, were affected and influenced by the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic and the Western treatments to prevent and treat the disease. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Ashley Dam to the CKS webinar for this evening. And I look forward to talking with you more and hearing your presentation. And of course, we'll leave time at the end of your presentation for question and answers from the participants. Welcome.
Thank you so much to everyone tuning in. It might seem a little bit confusing because it says that I'm muted, but you can hear me. And it's because I'm tuned in from two separate devices because, you know, two is better than one, apparently. Thank you so much, Dr. Chigas, for such a thorough and exciting and very sweet introduction. I couldn't have said it better than myself. I mean, very honored to be here, everyone. Yes, so I was formerly a CKS Senior Fellow, unfortunately, starting from February 2020, which is, you know, the perfect time to land in Cambodia right before giant pandemic wave of COVID hit us for the first time at a global scale. As he's mentioned, I'm a medical anthropologist, and anthropologists love to talk about the multiple, you know, types of realities and definitions that we all have for many different things that we take for granted. So hopefully my talk, which I consider a slice of my PhD research, repackaged and purposed specifically to target COVID, because right now I focus more on global health interventions as a part of my job. So is it all right if I share my screen now?
Let me ask you a few questions before you dive into your presentation, if that's okay. Because there's some very interesting things and that came to mind as I was reading over some of the work and writings that you've done. First of all, I was very interested to find out that you were initially doing a lot of work in Africa. And it was a kind of epiphany that you had at one point as you were beginning to do a project in Africa that steered you away from that project and brought you towards Cambodia. And I just want to tell the audience that you are part of the Khmer diaspora. And I don't know if you have both Khmer parents or just one. But if you could just explain how that shift in the trajectory of your work took place.
Yeah, so when I was an undergrad, I was very fortunate to have a very humble but also robust anthropological training. I did anthropological fieldwork in Banjul, the Gambia, and I focused on maternal health interventions and nutrition from a clinical setting. And during that time there, it was my first time really truly abroad alone, you know, being 18, 19, just turned 19, I think a week before I landed in Banjul. I kept making all these connections with my host family and my friends and my collaborators. And I kept saying, like, you know, a lot of the things that you do really remind me of things my mom would do. So my mom is from Phnom Penh, and our family escaped during the war on foot to Thailand, to the refugee camps, and then came to the United States. My father is Vietnamese and lives in Ho Chi Minh currently. But I would say that I grew up with more of a Khmer cultural upbringing because I went to Wat. I went to Khmer dance school for several years. and most of my family were surrounding me growing up. So I speak some Khmer, not perfectly fluent, but I guess that's just the tensions of being a diaspora kid and also third cultures, mixing together. But what happened to me is that I continued on my academic journey, first through St. Mary's, doing the research in the Gambia. And then I went to Oxford um, right after I got accepted to the Peace Corps. So after I did my undergraduate education, I applied to be a Peace Corps volunteer in Cambodia to do maternal health outreach because that was my interest and I wanted to learn more about, Khmer culture firsthand and also give my skills back in a constructive way, what I thought at the time. After I received a graduate entrance to Oxford, my parents were like, we didn't go to university, you have to go to that famous school. So I went to Oxford and continued my research in the Gambia on a more theoretical basis, looking at seasonality and how seasonality kind of, shifts our focus on priorities in certain things and how it affects healthcare seeking, specifically as it relates to nutrition supplementation programs. So basically, I was very curious about how pregnant people were prioritizing their nutrition during different times in the year. Tropical setting, they have something called the lean season, which is that period of time between agricultural cycles where your food stores are low, but your labor demands are high because you must plant whatever crops that you're sustaining on. And I was all set and ready to go. Through a turn of funding, I ended up in Northern Italy at the University of Gastronomic Sciences, a food studies university, because they were very interested in my research on sort of like demographic shifts, seasonal shifts in the Gambia, and food security. But when I arrived there in Italy, I had a complete identity crisis because someone told me, my supervisor told me, did you know that the PhD decision is the first mark you have in academia? It's what people know you for at the beginning. So it's a very big decision. And I had a complete identity crisis. And I said, you know what? I would love to go to Cambodia because I found so many different overlaps in my experiences with working in the Gambia initially. Surely there must be something, bringing me there. And I wanted to go to Tokmai, like obviously before my graduate studies, and I still wanted to do that. So I came up with a whole new different project. And I wanted to look at maternity and how that was like different based on the seasonality. And I started working with plants because one of my professors is an ethnobotanist of the Balkans and also southern and northern Italy. And I became just more involved in these tensions with food and plants. And I started to see the overlaps with, cocktail and then just drinking all these like different things that's supposedly good for me that my mom used to do when I was little. And I said, the good thing about research is that you can learn so much about the world, but also yourself. So I wanted to step back into that. And what really hurt me when I was a first generation US and also student university, I felt and I didn't find many Khmer colleagues. Like I didn't know anyone who was in graduate school to ask about this thing. So when I was jumping in, I kept thinking like, I wanted to be the type of person that I wanted. So that's what propelled me to do such research and go to Khmer, even though sometimes it felt really hard for me as a child who, grew up in this part of the diaspora with parents that were not fully Khmer in that way, that my dad is not Khmer. And those differences were made very apparent when I was growing up. Like I wasn't Khmer enough to talk or do research or do these things. So I thought, let me dedicate my studies to some real personal and knowledge learning on academic fronts. So that's how I got to where I am.
Well, it sounds like you went with your heart there, and that usually, from my experience at least, is a good indicator, a good compass for making life decisions. And my sense is that you're happy with your decision.
Oh, I am absolutely happy with my decision. It really scarred some of my colleagues though, because when you write your research proposal, you get accepted with funding and everything. It's kind of like a green light, right? You're accepted for this project. And I just walked in one day and I told them I'm not doing it.
Good for you. So real belief there, and trust in your instincts. Well, you bring up the term human ecological instabilities quite a bit, and I believe you're going to use that in your presentation as well. So just to give the audience a little bit better understanding and preview of what you mean by human ecological instability, specifically as it affects the use of traditional medicines and foods for treating diseases. And I have a second part to that question is your focus on maternal health and child nutrition. If you don't mind just commenting on that as well. They're two separate questions, I realize, so let's maybe just start with the first one.
Okay, so the human ecological approach was something I dived into during my medical anthropology degree. And the basic idea of the model is that we as humans are situated within these big environments, right? Entire ecology. So like, for example, your socioeconomic status is a part of your ecology. The immediate surroundings around you are you're a part of your ecology. We're just very stuck in these giant, connections, this nexus of things that are interconnecting. So just think of us as small beings in a big world, and everything in that world can influence our care decisions. And usually when we look at it from a health perspective, the takeaway is your surroundings impact you. The things in your life impact you. And when I say the phrase human ecological instability, I mean that your surroundings are changing. Your body is changing. Your circumstances are changing. It's just a really fancy way to say uncertainty. I also use uncertainty a lot in my writings and my actual dissertation, because that's what I'm just looking at. I'm looking at how when people feel like people in their environments react to unexpected changes or unexpected on a spectrum. So for example, I use 3 case studies. One of them is pregnancy, seasonality, and then COVID-19 in the form of a health crisis. So you would say that seasonality is relatively predictable. In June, it will rain. In July, it will rain. Now that's changing because of climate change, of course, but these are ideas that we can kind of put in a box and understand to be regularly occurring, right? Relatively predictable. The second one on that scale would be maternity, because, if you have all the right parts and the circumstances are right, yes, you can, become pregnant and experience different stages of maternity, but depending on a lot of different factors and circumstances, that might not be to completion or in a standardized way of experience. So that's kind of that middle ground of certainty versus uncertain. And then, fortunately for me, within the spectrum approach, I got stuck in the middle of a global crisis, COVID-19. And even though it was relatively terrifying for everyone, I'm sure, as you remember, it presented a moment to truly capture what it means for people and how they understand their health, what they prioritize, and how they seek care during a time of crisis. So that's what I mean when I look at human ecological instability. Like when your life is changing, whether it's expected or not, how does that impact how you feel about your health? What do you prioritize? And what kind of things do you do to seek care? Whether that be, wearing a mask, washing your hands, staying home altogether. And I kind of collage that in relation to the relationships between biomedicine and traditional Khmer medicine, which I understand to be many different types of systems. But for the sake of my research, I kind of grouped them together. The one distinction I make is traditional Khmer folk medicine, KFM. So the difference, in my opinion, for the sake of my research, is that traditional Khmer medicine is, knowledge and practices put forth by sort of authorities. So like healers, people who are considered elders or wise people and healers, practitioners, if you will. And the KFM, or the Khmer folk knowledge, is a non-specialist application of those ideas. So for example, if I didn't feel well and I went to a traditional healer and they told me to drink some, ginger with water, hot water, and some garlic inside, I would classify that knowledge as traditional Khmer medicine, so TKM. However, in my research, if I spoke to someone who said, oh, a healer told me to do this, I differentiate that as folk knowledge because I cannot be sure that this person remembered that information correctly or if they changed it to suit their own care needs. So I gave that differentiation between my work. And using that, my research just kind of looks at how those changes affect people's relationships with biomedicine and folk medicine and traditional medicine. And yeah, what was your second question? I'm sorry.
Kind of folded that really nicely into the answer to the first one. I asked about your focus on maternity care. So you gave that as an example of uncertainty in one's life, and whether conditions are good for the pregnancy or not will all add or not to the uncertainty in that person's life and how that person responds to or what kinds of medicines that person will seek out. One more question kind of regarding COVID-19 and how it impacted your research is, exactly that. When you landed in Cambodia, or I believe you had a completely different research plan than the day after, right? When COVID hit, and it changed completely your access to people and your mobility and everything else. So how did you have to really in mid-flight or reinvent the airplane in mid-flight?
Yeah, so my supervisor at the time, Dr. Stanley Oliashek, amazing medical anthropologist, human ecologist. I remember before I started fieldwork, I told him like I had this plan. I had this meticulous checklist. I had all these things, and I was like, I'm scared. I have a plan though. And then he said, throw out the plan. It's gonna be something different and unexpected. And he was like, but you should know that. You've done field work before. And I said, yes, I know, but this is the big one. This is the show. This is your doctoral field work. So I arrived on the February 19th, 2020, and I was in Phnom Penh at a hostel. And I remember very clearly like two separate conversations and moments. One of them being with my friend Bichia. He was sitting on the bar and he was smoking a cigarette, and he was like, people don't come and buy my property anymore, all these Westerner people, because they're scared of this virus. And I said, are you scared? He's like, no, it's fine. And then right after that, a woman passed by to sell mass, right? And I ended up buying a few packets from her just because I was wanting to help her out, but also very curious about how like Cambodia was handling what at the time they called like what the Wuhan virus, the Wuhan outbreak. My initial research plan was to look at seasonality. So I was going to have 3 months in Siem Reap in the dry season, looking at plants and collecting specimens, and then 3 months in the rainy season. And there was supposed to be a break in between. But what ended up happening was 3 weeks into the interview process, we had the pandemic outbreak officially declared by the WHO as well as CKS, kind of, telling us as fellows, like this is a very serious situation and how to adjust that. And I remember we went through a very intense conversation, and it was Ming Sapia and also Long Saram, so my two research collaborators, Hang Chen Sapia and then Saram, who worked with me on this project as translators and data collectors. And I said to them, do you feel safe? So we're checking in, like, do you feel safe enough to continue talking? And they said yes. And we would do this as many interviews as we could within a time frame, and every single day it was like, all right, do you feel safe? Are you worried? And I would buy mass and also increase the salaries because it was like a hazard pay thing. We were all like really scared and we didn't know what to do. And only did research stop once one person said that they didn't feel safe anymore. They were worried. So going from, a research method of in-person interviews, community cooking events, because the idea was to collect recipes with these plants, food medicine plants were being used for, like that was a dream, It's like, let's talk, let's eat some things, let's collect plants, let's go hiking. Like it was supposed to be this very beautiful, whimsical research project. And that turned into, us sitting in our houses alone, texting on Facebook and WhatsApp. And then Sophia and I trying to translate this interview questionnaire into an online survey. And what we ended up doing is like, we thought, okay, let's try online survey and phone trees. So we were just going to like call people, but then the connections were bad in the villages and we couldn't get clear audio. And we thought, how are we going to make sure that the audio is clear, it's documented, and we can look back and transcribe? But that was a nightmare. And then when we tried to do the transition to online surveys, we did a pilot where we gave it to some of our, contacts who were outside of Siem Reap. Actually, we sent it to people in Phnom Penh to see how viable it was. Like, was it interesting? Was it a good type of design? Like, did it translate over? And it just did not. And I just don't think that using these online surveys was a very effective method at all. I didn't even want to do it, but for the sake of the fact that I was there, I had to try something. We also tried looking into doing extra digital ethnography, which is like another method that I really enjoy, because in my giant nebulous of things that I study, I also study digital food and do a lot of online ethnography. And I started looking at traditional medicine uses and advertisements on Facebook in Khmer and English and French of like people having traditional remedies to handle COVID symptoms and COVID in general. And it's very interesting. But that wasn't enough to answer any of my research questions. And I had exhausted for the past 2 years looking online for things I could use for my research. So it's definitely collaging as you go. And also I wanted to return after, we had received vaccinations and stuff after a year or so into the pandemic, but I wasn't able to because I didn't feel safe, as well as my university, my Italian university didn't feel safe with me going back to Southeast Asia in general because of the Delta wave being so close during to the time I was supposed to go. And they just didn't want a repeat of me being, as they say, stuck again. So yeah, to anyone trying to do research anywhere, especially about health topics and change, you can't plan for it. It just happens and you just have to be there. You just show up.
Another case of uncertainty being everywhere all the time. So wonderful. With that said, and that really great introduction, thank you for all those comments. Please launch into the presentation.
All right. Hopefully it won't be too exhausted based on the little tidbits I already gave. Okay, let's see. Has it transitioned finally? All right. Can you see my slides? Oh, sorry, George, you're muted. Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you can see it, judging by your response.
Yes, I can see it perfectly fine.
Okay, lovely. So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Ashley Tutel Down. Welcome to my talk, Beyond Binaries, How Collaborative Approaches in Healing through Biomedicine, Traditional and Folk Medicine Practices May Expand Care Seeking and Care Opportunities for COVID-19. I'm tuning in from Maastricht, the Netherlands, and I apologize for any extra noise because I'm in the faculty. So for the agenda today, to get a really good understanding of my talk, this is a slice of my greater PhD project that I did over a few years ago. It's almost a year since I defended, so it's very strange to be going back to the roots, if you will, after working for a few months. But the idea is that I'll go over the design and the purpose of my PhD research, and then specifically focus on the COVID-19 findings, and then apply it to kind of suggestions that I would say for the Ministry of Health or other interested parties on how we can use, these different ways of knowing and ways of engaging with health, our bodies, and care within a Cambodian medical pluralistic context. So that's a lot of words, but basically what I'm saying is I'm going to go over my PhD research, focus on the COVID stuff, and give you some actionable suggestions on how we can increase care for everyone in many different contexts, especially, Cambodia, where we have biomedicine, traditional medicine, and everything in between. Okay. So for my PhD project, I had a really, really big question with lots of very interesting parts that tried to address the following research problems. Now, as a researcher coming into any situation, unfortunately, we're always looking for problems. But on the bright side, we're looking for ways to fix them. So when I was doing kind of a cursory glance into the literature about Cambodia and nutrition, because I'm a nutritional anthropologist, this specific box of medical anthro, I noticed that Cambodians, according to these reports, have low dietary diversity and nutritional status, while also having access to exceptional amounts of edible plant diversity. So despite having all these wonderful plants, why are we not making use of them? So this is a gap that I saw. Another thing I've noticed is that what's inconsistent in the literature is that scholars, government members, and NGO researchers could not agree on the trajectory of traditional medicine in Cambodia. Some people said it was going out of fashion. Some people said it was revitalizing. There was no consensus. So I thought, okay, let's do more research into that. That's interesting. Like, why does one say it's growing and one say it's not? And they were published within like 2 or 3 years of each other. There's something going on. But the third kind of problem I've noticed was that indigenous Khmer flora faces potential extinction within the next century, and their documentation is sparse and fragmented. Now, there's many reasons for this, first of all, which is climate change. In terms of the documentation, we're going to have to blame the regime. There's nothing other to say than that. Cambodia had over 1,200 academics before the genocide, and then at the end, roughly 80 survived, and none of them were botanists. So there is a knowledge gap in that way in terms of scholarship, as well as the actual physical documents and herbarium records being destroyed within that period of time. And then fourth would be like the scholarship on Khmer food, cuisine, and gastronomy is vastly understudied. I know that several ministries have recently launched cookbooks and initiatives to do gastrodiplomacy, which has been, in my opinion, relatively successful. I heard that the Taste of Angkor, which is the cookbook developed in the past few years, actually won an award for Best Asian Cookbook at the World Gourmand Conference, which I find nice. So at the time of this research, that was the point, and I still think there's much to be done. But using these research problems and kind of interesting topics, I kind of formed them together to the following research question, which, as Dr. Chikas mentioned, human ecological instabilities. And the question was, in what ways do human ecological instabilities caused by seasonality, maternity, and the COVID-19 pandemic shape how populations living in Siem Reap Province, Cambodia, use and consume traditional and Khmer folk food medicines? So that's a really big question. But as I said previously, I'm just looking at different types of change. So changing of seasons, changing of the body during maternity, and also changing of health circumstances, health crisis. So these are my 3 case studies. And I was just very interested in how people kind of just use and consume things. Like when those things change, does your use of the medicines change, or how much you eat of it change? That's what I was very fascinated with. And from that, I developed the following aims and objectives. I was looking at how human ecological changes shape how people select, prepare, and consume these traditional and folk medicines. I was interested in looking at the relationships between food and medicine within these systems. And I wanted to see what the future holds. How do they relate and what is the future? And these translated into the following objectives. I really am a qualitative researcher, love coding, but qualitative is definitely my heart and soul. And as an anthropologist, it's natural, isn't it? So I was looking to capture qualitative data on those changes that occur during those 3 case studies. I wanted to make lists of medicinal plants used within the remedies and food medicines, if they were considered food medicine. and the recipes. And I wanted to identify like common sources or vectors of knowledge. So if people knew about traditional like Khmer medicine or had some Khmer folk knowledge about medicine, where did it come from? Where is it spawning and is it growing, or is it like completely stopping? And as we mentioned before, I'm a very interdisciplinary type of person. So therefore, being a medical anthropologist, an ethnobotanist, and a food studies person, I had to combine literature from all of those fields to make this study, in my opinion, like cohesive. So from a medical standpoint, I kind of pulled from Kleinman's explanatory models, health sectors, and health systems as cultural systems, which is basically saying I use this idea of how in different contexts, people have different relationships and explanations for why they're sick and how they're feeling. And one of Kleinman's key arguments is also to kind of look at health systems as a really big lens into how cultures unfold. And you can use this for any type of cultural setting. So that's why I thought it was very important. I also used Sildrick's Leaky Bodies, Anne-Marie Moll's Body Multiple, Mary Douglas's Social Bodies, and also Elizabeth Shu's The Body Ecologic. Because if we're looking at changes outside and around us, we also have to look at the changes inside us and how they relate. And these are just some theories from medical anthropologists that kind of talk about this malleability or porosity, or the fact that things blend into each other, especially when it comes to health and healthcare seeking. From the food studies side, I also pulled from the Food Medicine Continuum by Dr. Andrea Peroni, who was one of my supervisors, and he talked about how, depending on certain circumstances, people would put certain edibles on a spectrum as medicinal or only edible. And I wanted to apply that model for the food medicines I encountered in Cambodia. I also appreciated India Mandelkern's idea of taste-based medicine, which is when something tastes more bitter, it must be good for you. Because I found that came up a lot within my research and conversations, not only with my own family when it came to Khmer medicine, but also my research participants. Some other really key books that I really enjoyed was Beyond the Body Proper by Farquhar and Locke, Atkins' Eating on the Wild Side, Peroni and Price's Eating and Healing, Ovechkin, Trankel's Cambodians and Their Doctors, as well as Banwell, Oyesic, and Dixon's When Cultures Impact Health. Because for me, all these pieces of literature just made the argument like, the body is beyond just our physical confines. We have social bodies where we have relationships with people. A body is a family and all these different things. Etkin talked about the importance of foraging and eating wild plants. At Peroni and Price really link it together with the idea of like, when you're eating, you're also healing. And then Ovechkin and Tranquil and Banwell and Elias and Dixon really make this kind of relationship between how our cultural surroundings and conditioning impact how we experience and understand health. With Ovechkin and Tranquil really talking on the Khmer case, or like one of the perspectives of what Cambodia has uniquely is different. And from that, I kind of developed my research project and just sort of a timeline. So I did archival research, I developed my research tools, I did networking, I wrote a lot of grants. Phase 2 was data collection, and then extra archival research, transcription, data analysis, and then finally I wrote the thing. And where my CKA fellowship started was in that fieldwork portion on this continuum. And during that time, I tried to the best of my ability to collect data, to be a sponge, to be in Cambodia, even though it was a Cambodia that Cambodians didn't understand and I didn't understand because it was a COVID Cambodia. It was like a very strange moment of time for all of us. And I drew from very different things, like methodologically, I did ethnography. So I did rapid ethnography because what else can you do when the world is crumbling around you and everyone has to stay inside, right? So I did rapid ethnography, which involves just being a sponge and being there. I did visual ethnography. I took film and digital photos. And I also did auto ethnography, which is just a fancy way of saying I wrote in a journal every single day. I wrote the weather. I wrote what song I listened to. I wrote a quote from what my tuk-tuk driver said to me that day, or my research colleagues. I did semi-structured interviews, both individual and groups, because if you've ever tried to do an interview solely with someone alone in the village, I feel like that's impossible because everyone's just hanging out and everyone wants to join. And then I welcomed them and we had a really nice conversation. I did botanical voucher specimen collections. So it's a fancy way of saying snipping some plants and pressing them down in a lot of books and newspapers that I collected from stalls nearby. And we did some recipe collections. And here's my wonderful research team and research collaborators. We had Mang Saram, we had Ming Sapia, and then we had Vakru Pau, and then Dr. Suleiman Dikul, who were working with me at the National Herbarium. And there's my friend Darina, who did translation for a lot of different science communication posts that I ended up writing up. I couldn't have done it without them. And you know, I'm still really happy that even though I landed in Cambodia during the pandemic, I got to work with them even briefly. It was like such an enriching experience. And from that, I also did, you know, I ate things, I took photos, met all these different people, and I drew. That was something that was very important for me, like visually capturing the experience. So what did we find? Well, we had in-person research activities from February 29th to March 27th. And during this time, I gathered insights as a team. Of course, we gathered insights from 40 people living across 10 villages and 4 communes within this Siem Reap municipality district. They're outlined here on this handy dandy map. So what's very interesting is that all of the research participants had some knowledge of traditional Khmer medicine and folk medicine remedies and practices. 34 out of 40 were women aged 20 to 76, and 33 out of 34 of them were mothers. 6 out of 40 were men ages 25 to 71, and all of them were fathers. 4 out of 40 were TCAM practitioners, so healers and sellers. They identified a sort of a wide spectrum of different plants, 130 different plant species, of which I ended up matching to botanical keys that I received from the Archaeology Development Foundation, I think they believe they're called, the School of Field Studies, SFS. And we matched 67 of them with the scientific names, and then the remaining 63 species only with their local Khmer names. And they were organized thematically as, you know, maternity only. So 112 of them were only for maternity only. We have a general cures section for like toothaches, bone aches, fevers. And then also from these designations, we had the food designation. So also food, 37 of them. And what we found was kind of, I organized into 3 unique dynamics because, you know, how novel is something. I don't know the entire history of Cambodia. I don't know what everyone is perfectly researching, but for me, this is what stood out. So first of all is the idea of Khmer biologies, which is this kind of, and I'll explain it later, but this idea that Khmer bodies require Khmer medicine or healing solutions that are sourced from Cambodia, whether actually or conceptually. The second one is healing commensality. So when I had a lot of these participants talk about dishes that are healing, a lot of their children spoke up and said like, oh yeah, I know about that too, because when my mom was pregnant, all she cooked was that, or all my grandma cooked was that, or all my dad cooked was that. So I started looking at how these, you know, food medicines began to kind of become a group practice with the family meal, and how when people are eating together, even though the food medicine is targeted for the person who requires the healing, they are in practice healing together. So healing commensality, where commensality gains a kind of, you know, curative property, if you will. Also, the idea of Khmer taste-based medicine, as I previously mentioned, was Mendel Kern's idea. And it's this kind of organization of certain foods under the hot and cold spectrum, or the humoral medicine spectrum, as it's called mostly, and how a lot of my participants talked about how they could tell the healing properties of a certain edible food or plant based on the taste. And that was like something I really liked, but I could talk about it at a different talk. So the overarching themes that I found in this research was that the beliefs and practices of both traditional Khmer medicine and Khmer folk medicines are very fluid entities, and then both of them are individually tailored, but they're mutually intelligible. So especially like when you have a heightened health threat or stress, people can kind of understand each other. I found out that food choices can be kind of articulations of people seeking and experiencing care if you look at them under the traditional and the folk medicine system. And I believe that even though a lot of research has said that there's a decline in traditional medicine, I don't think that's the case. I think that researchers are just missing them because they're so heavily integrated into daily routines and practices. So like just waking up in the morning and having a tea that your grandma's making with a lot of medicinal plants because she tells you to drink it. Like that's a medicinal practice, but people don't consider that as that because it's just a thing that your grandma does with you or forces you to do, and you're not sick. So because of how people are framing and understanding it, that gets missed. So the takeaway overall is that it's not declining. I don't think that traditional medicine or folk medicine is declining at all in Cambodia. I directly challenge that, even though the demographic health surveys, say otherwise. But of course, that's another question of methodology, but I argue that they just have transitioned to newer forms, and they keep transforming into new applications in response to health uncertainties. So when I focused on this case study of COVID-19, I found out that most study participants would use both folk medicine and traditional medicine in order to prevent or treat COVID-19. So of the 40 interviews that we did, only up until like interview 23 did it officially get declared as a pandemic. So then I started to count it as those. So from of those 23 extra interviews, 12 people said that they would use traditional and folk medicine, either just that or along with Western biomedicine to be sure to take the Western biomedicine first. There's kind of a choreography to the care. So it's like, yes, overwhelmingly, more than 50% or half of the group or so would be interested in using traditional or folk medicines to treat or prevent COVID-19. So they conceptualized it as kind of a mosaic, I describe it, of commonly treated symptoms as opposed to a novel disease. So like, not even in the West, but in many other different countries from the biomedical standpoint, right? We saw COVID-19 as a novel disease, like a thing that's never been happened before. They always say the novel coronavirus. But for some of the people I was speaking to, they were just like, it's just a cough plus a fever plus all these different things, and we know how to treat them. So they had a very optimistic perspective in handling that. And I found that very interesting. And they, from the people I spoke to, they already had 6 recipes for me. So like 4 of them were prophylactic or preventative, and then curative. So 2 of them were treatments they suggested. And some of these remedies included ritual or activity counterparts. So from the prophylactic standpoint, we have hot water infused with garlic, hot water infused with ginger. And I think that ginger is like the funniest case study or option, because I remember when we were doing the field work, Ming Sapia was complaining to me. She was like, have you seen the price of ginger now? It's like 4 times the price. People are going a bit, insane with the ginger hoarding. We also had this very interesting one that was talking about boiling an unfertilized / hatched chicken egg and eating that. It was like a very special type of egg. We also had one healer that was saying, like, if you follow Buddhist philosophies, you'll be pure and safe from COVID, and gave some examples of like sitting, walking, standing up, and sleeping, and being in harmony with your body and with religion, and how that was enough to kind of safeguard you from everything. There was another one talking about a very particular type of herb, and also as a herb to induce diarrhea. It doesn't matter which one. But the person was like, there's one specific one that does it best, that makes you very diarrhea-y. And then from that, you would cleanse your body and eat some baba and then take a warm bath. And doing all of these in combination will protect you, in theory, in their eyes, from COVID-19. And then the last one was to boil some bok leaves and then wipe your body with that fluid. And then from that, your body will reduce fever. So it was more so of like the last one being a treatment to handle fever, but they also took it as a general COVID-19 treatment. And then what we pulled away from this is that participants became, in a time of health crisis, more flexible to trying other medical systems remedies for COVID-19. Like even the people who identified as purely biomedical people, people who only go to the doctor, only go to the hospitals, only trusted, biomedicine, were a bit more, well, if biomedicine doesn't know, then I guess I would try. They were more open to it. And then I found out that people generally had different categories of conditions that they would prefer to use certain systems. So either biomedicine or traditional and folk medicine. And for COVID-19, it was kind of a split case. So as I mentioned previously, there's a sort of choreography to the care. And a lot of people stress that you can't mix the medicine in the wrong order because then they will fight. They will fight each other. So the idea is to take biomedicine first and then take traditional medicine second, and not the other way around. So I also found out that, when making healthcare decisions, people relied on many different factors. This is that whole like human ecological approach, right? There's many different factors pushing you in directions. And I sort of related them to some of the unique findings I found. So as an individual, a lot of my participants talked about, their abilities and resources to kind of access things, of course, their immediate environments to also influence how they would treat with medicine. If there was a seller, like a traditional medicine seller closer, or if they had someone in their family was a practitioner, they'd be more likely to use it, right? Just because of proximity, convenience. It also depends on how they are experiencing their condition, like the severity of their conditions. If they recognize that they were sick at all to begin with, that influenced how likely they were to like choose one system over the other and vice versa. Also have a very meticulous social support network, which I organized here to family, friends, and community members. But of course, we all know that when we're sick, we're all sick, especially when you live in such a communal setting, right? But I found what is very interesting is about when seeking and deciding how to make, address health issues, my research participants kind of didn't listen to these traditional or commonly found in Southeast Asia generally, like gender roles or age distinctions. So like in my brain, I thought, oh, if my mother were to suggest me something, I would be more likely to, or my grandmother's. But people tended to organize it and prioritize it based on what they say experience. So for example, some people would say like, oh, for traditional medicine, I would actually trust my dad, even for like the maternity decisions, because he has more experience with dealing with plants in traditional medicine and things like that. And the same thing for COVID, when they were relying on that really strong traditional knowledge and folk knowledge bases, those kind of expectations about gender and age starts to kind of melt away, which really shocked me, to be honest. And what I found out is that with the care-seeking rationalities between the two systems, or the 2 to 3 systems, depending on how you want to organize them, I just grouped both folk medicine and traditional medicine together because they come under that big umbrella of traditional, complementary, and alternative medicine as defined by the WHO. And I do that not because I technically agree, but more so because it's an easier signaling for other researchers interested in the area. But basically what I found out is that the reasons why the people chose traditional medicine over biomedicine is that because they believed that if you heal yourself with traditional and folk medicine, you'll be thoroughly healed. Like you will not have that ailment for the rest of your life, as opposed to biomedicine, which was seen as more of a superficial treatment, but you'll still be susceptible for the same health crisis or experience. They recognize that it is slow. They recognize that traditional medicine is slow and biomedicine is fast. They appreciated that traditional and folk medicine is perfectly tailored versus the standardization of biomedicine, the one size fits all. But what's funny is that when we talk about standardization in biomedicine, Some of my research participants really talked about how they really liked that. That doctors had like very standardized training and that everyone agreed on the same thing, versus when you talk to one traditional healer, they might not agree with the other one. And it becomes very confusing to make a healthcare decision because people are telling you different things. I heard that, you know, traditional medicine and folk medicine is very natural and they wanted to maintain that. And biomedicine is just an imitation of, you know, the naturalness of plant medicine. I had one person say to me, it's like, you know, pills are just crushed up plants anyway, like plants concentrated, which I appreciated. There's also the price difference. So traditional medicine and folk medicine being cheaper and biomedicine being expensive. And my favorite, it doesn't expire. Traditional medicine, folk medicine doesn't expire. So therefore, like, you know, it's a better bang for your buck, as they say. You spend some money and you're healed for as long as you have your stores. And then biomedicine expires. I also found out there's certain sort of, you know, things that people are more likely to treat with the traditional medicine or the folk medicine. For example, a lot of women talked about how, as a Khmer woman, they should use TKM and KFM because it's a Khmer woman thing. It's a Khmer cultural pride thing. You know, my mom did it and she was fine. We've done it for centuries. As a fever reducer, people are more likely to use the traditional folk medicine, blood pressure reduction, malaria, skin conditions, and even broken bones. I was very interested in that, broken bones and achy bones. And then on the flip side, biomedicine tended to be used by people if they had allergic reactions to TKM or KFM in the past. If they have a long history of families using biomedicine in general, they were more likely to use biomedicine. And on the flip side of that, if they had a family history with a bad experience with traditional medicine, like one woman was explaining to her like how she didn't use traditional medicine during her maternity because her sister used it and got very sick. So she didn't want to use it. So that was like one inclination. Also because biomedicine is considered like fast. If you have a time sensitive condition, meaning that like you're experiencing a lot of pain and you need it fixed now, they're more likely to use that. And then cancer. And I just wanted to quote my sister, my adorable nurse sister, about this because I was explaining my talk to her yesterday over FaceTime. And she's like, oh, yeah, it's like, you know, bandage medicine versus not. It's symptoms versus the source. So that's what I wanted to quote her on that, because for a lot of my participants, biomedicine treats the symptoms, but traditional and folk medicines actually treats the source, which I found very illuminating. So this is her little moment, like my sister, the scholar nurse. And, you know, how this relates to like very interesting things is that idea of Khmer biologies, you know, that a lot of people made the case for Khmer bodies benefiting from Khmer-informed medicine and care. So we can look at care choices as expressions of individual identities and relationships with different health systems. So we have to think about kind of like there's a trust and familiarity. And this was especially true, like, you know, after the war and the genocide and diaspora populations, but also there's this ongoing kind of affinity for, you know, what is yours? And I found out that within this conception of like uniquely Khmer bodies is that biomedicine is seen as incompatible or insufficient. So people said like it doesn't work for our bodies. It doesn't provide like a true healing. And that's, you know, a contained thing, but they're very strongly united on this bounds. And, you know, as someone who studies care and health and things, I personally believe that care is meeting people halfway for where they are. Like adequate and sufficient and good care involves, you know, speaking to people who are in need of the care and what kinds of things that they need. And for me, even though that this was a bit of a tension with my biomedical understandings of things, like this was what my research participants wanted. They wanted care that represents them and makes them feel better. So what can we do with this in relation to COVID-19? Well, what we can do on an infrastructural and actionable standpoint is encourage and support different plant remedies to manage certain COVID-19 symptoms. There's been exceptional amounts of research, especially coming out of Southeast Asia and also specifically China, who has a very robust, you know, traditional medicine paradigm and research facilities for studying certain plant interactions. using evidence-based approaches, I think that we should have more initiatives to kind of make that knowledge available. So if there is a plant growing nearby that can manage your fever, your cough, your body aches, and alleviate some of that burden from the biomedical side, either supply or care, we should advertise that. We should really encourage, citizens going out and making use of their sources so we can have a sustainable means of action for people who might not be as resource advantaged. I think we should continue the holistic study of plants and their roles within traditional and folk medicine. I know that we have the Center for Traditional Medicine, but I want more funding for that. I want more students across the world and in Khmer to be interested in their plants, because Cambodia and also mainland Southeast Asia has some of the most exceptional concentrations of biodiversity, and it's at risk. And we should be very happy and proud to have these wonderful, miraculous plants that can help us. I think that we should really focus on the kind of collaborative development of health crisis management and care policies and interventions with a traditional component. And doing so would maximize care access for people across all different bounds, because even though people like to think, that traditional medicine is only a poor people thing, a rural people thing, that's not the case around the world. Traditional medicine and complementary medicine is used across all different wealth quintiles. So by investing and considering these things within crisis management and care policies interventions, we can really do a lot of good for more people. I also think that we should do more research into community attitudes about collaging care practices between biomedicine and traditional medicine and folk medicine. Because there's this divide, either you believe in biomedicine or you believe in the other stuff. And there's a lot of stigma attached. And a lot of my research participants talked about that kind of management of stigma and how they didn't feel safe receiving care, or they felt bad. But I think that by leveraging both of the good qualities of biomedicine and traditional and folk medicine together, we can really do a lot of good work on all fronts, and make sure that if people are mixing these things, that they do it in a safe manner, that they do it in a standardized way that is effective. And that goes in a lot in line with the WHO's dream and endeavor and policy about traditional, complementary, and alternative medicine. We want more evidence-based things, we want more collaborative care, and we want them to be safe and effective, because it's a very important resource for people in my research area, but also people all around the world. So even these sort of insights from the research in Siem Reap can be applied to all these different contexts in places where we have a lot of tropical botany and we have a lot of interest in leveraging many different types of healthcare systems. And so what's the stepping point from this? Well, I think we should also do research within the rainy season, where all the plants are really growing and blossoming. So I think I missed a lot, even though we had a lot of data. I want to continue more voucher specimen collections for the National Herbarium. I think, even though I hate saying I put it in quotes, the post-pandemic interviews about how people are relating to healthcare and plants and traditional medicine and all those things together. And then there's 3 other things on the side, which is the Khmer Food and Cuisine Digital Archive, which I'm kind of working on. And as I explained previously, before the seminar started, to the CPS people, that I recently received a grant from National Geographic to continue my work in Cambodia. And I will be returning in June to look at the Planet Plate Garden in Otniemiche. So the idea is that we do these medicinal plants and food plant research interviews again, and then we actually make a garden in the Agritech Center run by Green Shoots Foundation. So we'll have this nice, practical hub for people to learn about plants, cook with them, share plants with different generations or interested people. And then also from the writing standpoint, as an academic, I try to write things, all my feelings about research, and encapsulate them in nice ways. And I'm writing a book. I feel like everyone always says that they're writing something, so I am attempting to write a book. If you're interested, also, I have this exhaustive list of things that I've already written about my research from different angles. If you're interested on food, traditional medicine, ethnobotany, and where they all collide, that's what I do. I also did some stuff about specifically researching COVID-19 in Cambodia, which is kind of an extension of the work here. And these are my contact details. Thank you for your time. And just to relate it back, this is a photo that my cousin sent me actually when I was finishing up my dissertation. And it's a picture, the last picture my family took together in Cambodia before the takeover and the genocide. But I like to look at it sometimes because it looks like they're like really happy and just, hanging out and stuff. And it makes me always come full circle, these sorts of things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you very much. Before you leave this slide, do you mind telling us who in this picture?
Okay, so I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is my mom.
That's your mom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my mom. These are my aunts and uncles because we had a big family. My grandma had 11 children. Unfortunately, 4 of them passed away at a young age, and also one from cancer. This is my grandma, and this is my great-grandma.
Really? Okay. So your great-grandma, your grandma, and these are your uncles and aunts and your mother. So one, two,
yeah, it was
7 out of 11?
Yeah, 7 out of 11. And another thing another full circle moment I felt like I just recently learned actually is that I'm very fortunate to say that my mother's family survived the genocide in full. However, my mom recently told me that one of the reasons why is because my grandpa is a secondary school teacher. And one of the things that he did, he's a principal. One of the things he did was he paid for poorer students, uniforms and books and stuff like that, and including one of the Khmer Rouge leaders. So they were actually put on a truck or something to be killed. But then the Khmer Rouge leader saw my grandpa and was like, no, we keep them. They're really nice people. So my mom was like, it's good that you ended up in academia because you have to be nice to your students, because you never know where being nice can lead you.
Well, actually, listening to your talk, it's one of the things that comes through to me is what a practical approach you take to this study of using whatever works best practices to lead to the best results for healthcare of the people being treated, whether it's Western or traditional medicine and a combination of both of them. It was clear to me that you're out there to do good in the world and contribute to that knowledge. With that said, and before we get to, I see there's one question, there's 2 now, we'll get to them. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about a couple of things that you said that were really interesting to me. And one of them, I guess I would put them in the category of Khmer cultural identity and how it seems to be so well established about what it means to be Khmer. And that always surprises me, I think, after repeated crises historically, the notion of what it means to be Khmer continues to persist, and it seems to even get stronger. And when you said things like, Khmer bodies require Khmer medicines, for example, I mean, that's a very interesting statement. It means that my body has a distinct, way of working that only will respond to certain types of medicines that would not, work for other people. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how people identify themselves and their bodies and the way they work as being Khmer.
Yeah, I was honestly one of my favorite things about when I was doing the data analysis. I was like, I have so many quotations and insights about people really concerning that. And honestly, I think it has a lot to do with the very flexible nature of the Khmer medical system. So as I mentioned previously, it runs all partially on a humoral model, like hot and cold and wet and drying things. And because, there's this kind of understanding that you can adjust being healthy by adjusting your balance, right? Your humoral balance inside. And one of the ways you do that is, practices, physically moving, of course, but also eating things. And I think that just kind of understanding, that inherent understanding, if you've been exposed to either traditional or folk medicine in Cambodia, is just kind of a reality for some people. And the idea that, your body can be adjusted and perfectly in tune with a certain place, I think is kind of a sentiment that just transcended. So like to be Khmer and have a Khmer body would be, one that is flexible and one that is in tune and in balance with your environment. And therefore, because the Khmer medicine systems tend to be more sympathetic to that, as opposed to biomedicine, which is very much like, here is your problem. You are a machine. Here's the solution for it. Mm-hmm. And if you have any type of adverse reaction, then maybe you're kind of messed up. Like, it just seems a bit more of a, I don't know, palatable or digestible kind of way of looking at yourself. Mm-hmm. I would like to do more research into that because so some of the theories that I mentioned, for example, the idea of the social bodies and the body multiple, which is Mary Douglas and Anne-Marie Moll, they basically talk about how when people experience illness, they have different types of experience of their bodies. They have the sick version of themselves, the healthy version of themselves, and then somewhere in between. And when we look at that and as an extension on a social capacity, when you look at how your healthy body interacts with other people, also how your sick body interacts with people, your relationships change, your expectations about your capacity and ability to do things also changes. So it kind of goes to say, even on like a fun theory level, which I would say that I love theory, but not everyone loves theory, basically is that Khmerness can be expressed in so many ways. And for a lot of my research participants, a lot of the reasons why they chose Khmer medicine is because of their affinity for this understanding that it's something that Khmer people just do, just understand. So if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of situation.
And the fix is restoring balance. And I guess that's what I'm hearing from you. And that's something that Khmer believe they have an understanding of, that Western medicine, biomedicine, may not approach illness in that way of restoring balance. That's where the Khmer body versus the non-Khmer body would come in.
Well, I wouldn't say, yeah, I guess maybe when I say like my biologies, it's just more of like how my research participants, conceptualize themselves. As you said, it's not so much a designation that I put upon them. I also don't think it's uniquely Khmer, in my opinion, to rely on a humoral model, because it's very much a common model everywhere. It's just for them in particular, that was a big part of it. So I'm just kind of trying to conceptualize that in that way.
I see what you mean. I think I articulated that poorly. I don't want to define any kind of Khmer-ness that's too specific or defined. So let me move on and ask now you to respond, please, to a couple of the questions that we have. So one of our participants, Rachel Harrison, asks, in Thailand, many people use the herbal medicine, now I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, I don't believe, fatalizone, to treat and prevent COVID. Was that also the case in Cambodia? I think the Latin name is Andrographis niculata.
I have not heard that directly from my research participants during the time I was there, because it's still very early on. But I remember a whisper network where Ming Sapia actually told me, he's like, yeah, apparently in Thailand they found this plant. So like along like the grapevine of like hearing things, I did hear that, but I didn't include it in my my research because it wasn't contained within the methodology. But I think if you were to do a study about certain plants like nowadays, like within a different time frame, I'm sure it would be in there just by geographical proximity and just kind of the overlappings between Thai traditional medicine. Also just the position of Siem Reap as a city, so people moving through.
Excellent, thank you. The next question from Eric White. How did your research findings and conclusions relate to the general anthropological literature on medical pluralism, or the literature specifically about medical pluralism in Cambodia? How do your research findings and conclusions either reinforce or challenge their models of care seeking and caregiving within a spectrum of healthcare options?
Ooh, you know what this question feels like? It feels like a PhD defense question.
How did your research findings and conclusions relate to the general anthropological literature? I guess were your findings and conclusions consistent with the general knowledge or literature on medical pluralism, or in general, or medical pluralism in Cambodia specifically? So was there something consistent or inconsistent about what you found in the combination of use of traditional and Western medicines that is consistent with the general literature on that topic?
Yeah, so one of the great books that I mentioned earlier was Cambodians and Their Doctors. So for the medical pluralistic standpoint, they kind of outlined this mild alienation or just kind of reluctancy to kind of return to traditional medicine after the genocide, because it was sort of like forbidden, repackaged and repurposed to be this kind of survivalist tactic, right? People like to say that Western medicine or biomedicine, I want to say just biomedicine because I don't think that biomedicine is inherently Western. But I think for the sake of just sort of like signaling, as I said earlier about terminology, it's just to kind of interlink other topics together. They outline that, biomedicine wasn't completely dismantled. And during that time, everyone else outside of the regime was forced to survive on whatever they could. Practitioners weren't allowed to heal, like traditional practitioners weren't allowed to heal. It was repurposed as Khmer Rouge medicine or revolutionary medicine. And that kind of hysteria and reluctancy to kind of push away traditional medicine because of the trauma of having to use it to like you either use it or die kind of situation. I did notice that in some of my research participants and their reflections. And then at the same time, because time has passed, there's this kind of like curiosity, this kind of need to return to this shared idea of kindness and approach to health and utilizing resources nearby and like really valuing the merit of systems that were already there. So I wouldn't say that my conclusions about medical pluralism were completely pushed in either direction. So like overly, saying like, oh yeah, traditional medicine is on the decline, like within the context of the medical pluralism of Cambodia, which is suggested by the Ministry of Health's demographic health survey, where they outline and do a survey on care practices and care seeking in Cambodia. And they say that like 1.5% of the population uses traditional medicine. That was certainly not the case. And they tried to do that kind of medical pluralism perspective where it's like, this is the public sector, the private sector, and this is this type of practitioner and this. And I think my findings completely combat that. It's absolutely not true in my research experience. So if anything, I would probably be reinforcing a lot of the work done by sort of like, I would say like early career researchers in the area, where they went to these different contexts around the province, and they found out it's like a very high working knowledge of these plants and of their use amongst people. I just think it's a problem of the research methodology in terms of the conflicts I found with the medical pluralism standpoints of other research reports. Like, for example, I always remember this Turner et al. 2017. They did research in Siem Reap about sort of like infants' 1,000 days of life, and also, the use of traditional medicine and stuff during maternity. And they interviewed a lot of people that came to their clinic. whether or not they use traditional medicine, and they, quoted a lot of insights from these people talking about how it's on the decline. And it's not to say that I didn't receive some comments about people saying that it's on the decline. Like I have lots of insights of people saying it's on the decline, but in practice, it's not. It's kind of like this imagination where they say it's like, oh, people aren't using anymore, the young people. And then when you speak to the young people, they know about it, or they Google about it, or they have Facebook groups discussing it. It's just a problem of methodology. Like Turner et al. Asked people who went to a biomedicine clinic whether or not they use traditional complementary medicine. And now, based on all the commentaries of stigma and that kind of hysteria about being casted aside as anti-science or anti-biomedicine, people hide these things. And that's why I would see the tensions are. It's methodology and stigma.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think your results on how people responded to COVID respond to this question. I think you said it's just under 50% would rely only on traditional medicine in that particular case. And no, maybe I'm misremembering that. When you had that 23 out of 40.
Yeah, it's just over. So like of the 23 people who gave their insights about COVID-19, like 12 of them said, yeah, I would use traditional complementary medicine. But in addition, like either they would only use that or with biomedicine. So the idea is that they're open to use things together as long as it ensures them care, whether it be like preventative or curative, either way. And I think that's an underutilized fact because, when you're on these two sides, and I say this all the time when I tell people that I study traditional complementary alternative medicine, they're always like, so you're anti-science. I was like, no, I'm not anti-science. I'm pro-care. I'm pro-curing.
Yeah, that kind of relates to this final comment by Hans Sok. I wish the speaker would look in depth on issues related to Khmer traditional medicine. My experience as a Khmer and a former MD in the country, I'm often left speechless when hearing or seeing a person claim to be able to treat cancer, COVID, diabetes, HIV, with a new powerful remedy for a specific disease. And I think that speaks to your case of it's not either or, it's using things in a collaborative way. I think we could go on for a long time here. I'm really intrigued by this whole idea of how people understood COVID, and how certain treatments were applicable and certain treatments were not, or there's some preference for some treatments and more preference for other treatments, either biomedical or traditional medicine or a combination of the two, and the reasons behind that. That's what really intrigues me. Why would someone, say, well, these two treatments can be used together, but the Western treatment first, because we don't want the two medicines fighting each other, I think is the way you described it. So we have to use them in a way so that they're compatible with each other. Now, these ideas are very interesting, and I think they open up a whole new range of questions regarding how people see themselves in their bodies and illnesses affecting them, and the different ways of understanding that. But I think we'll have to wait for your next research project to jump into those kinds of questions and similar ones. So we're just about out of time here, and there are no other questions. So unless you have any other final comments, I will just thank you again and wrap things up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to Dr. Zock's comment about being flabbergasted about, these claims. I really resonate with that. I strongly believe that. But what I'm trying to push towards is to kind of just pull back, my first cringe reaction to that and just realize, we have evidence-based medicine to show that some of these plant concoctions work. And if we can just emphasize the ones that work to kind of alleviate the burden of certain, certain medications and stuff, we'd be more effective with our resources and also the promotion of safe practices in this way. Because, countless papers and things that I found, of course, are considered detrimental towards health, especially within the maternity practices. And also, culture. The TKM and the KFM is considered a barrier to some types of care. Like people won't, seek care because they think they can get through it, or so like it should be think to be like a Khmer identity thing. So yeah, I think that the first step is kind of addressing the stigma. So, social psychologists, they say that like to address stigma, you can approach it in 3 following effective ways. There is protest, education, and contact. So in terms of reducing the stigma around traditional medicine in order to be, effectively utilized in a safe manner that is effective with biomedicine and biomedical approaches, the first thing would be to protest all of the defunct science. So to just kind of like revolutionary empower traditional healers to have, standardized recipes and care, which I understand the Center for Traditional Medicine is trying to do or has been doing. And to make it safer in that way, there's the education component, to show other traditional healers that these are the effective, safe remedies, right? And these are their interactions with a lot of common biomedical drugs. And then the third is to maintain contact with these groups, these with practitioners. I know it's hard from a logistical standpoint, but if you can just maintain these connections informally and formally, online and off, to just continue the collaboration, because I still think that even from my time here and when I read papers about this topic coming out, I still think there is that divide. As I said previously, when people say, oh, you study traditional medicine, you're anti-science, I'm not. So as soon as we can challenge that, we can have a more effective care. So that's why the key takeaway of my talk is collaboration, evidence-based collaboration.
Excellent. Well, on that note, and I think that's a great note to end on, thank you again for a wonderful presentation, a very informative and interesting one. And thank you for everyone who joined today's presentation. And we'll sign off. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.